Thanks, everyone. So I'm Ihor, and yeah, I'm going to talk about formal verification and whether that leads to better security. I'm a systems engineer. I'm not a formal methods person. However, I do work in the team that developed the SEL4 microkernel. That's the world's first formally verified operating systems kernel. And so I know a lot of formal methods people, and I'm also even friends with some of them. I've heard a lot about formal methods, and I've heard a lot about how formal verification is great and how it leads to better security and so on. And slowly that message has sunk in, but it took me a while to really kind of understand why that's the case as a systems person. So I'm going to try to distill some of that knowledge here and hopefully pass it on to you as well. Quick show of hands, who here considers themselves a formal methods person? All right, that's what I thought, not very many. So that's good, because I'm not one either. So as I mentioned, we're the Trustworthy Systems group, and we developed a formally verified operating systems microkernel. And when that got released, and when we started doing things, we started seeing headlines like these. Hackerproof coding, hackers can't break this, hackerproof, it's unhackable, et cetera, et cetera. So when you see these kinds of headlines, you're either going to cringe with dread or you're going to get giddy with anticipation that you're going to break this hackerproof code. So I want to talk about whether formal verification really does lead to better security and whether that's the same as hackerproof code. So is it really true that we have hackerproof code or not? I'll give you a bit of a spoiler. Yes, it does lead to better security. But no, that's not the same as hackerproof code. So I'm going to give an overview of formal verification and introduction to non-FM people. Then I'm going to talk about why we claim that formal verification does lead to better security. So what is better security and why does it lead to that? And then I'm going to talk about why that isn't the same as hackproof code, why it's not a silver bullet. So formal verification. Formal verification is proving properties about stuff with math. Now, properties can be a lot of different things. This can be correctness. This can be security. This can be things like liveness, safety, and so on. And then stuff can also be a lot of different things. This can be code. This can be protocols. This can be hardware. This can be processes, et cetera. People prove properties about lots of different stuff. So for this talk, I'm going to focus on proving correctness about code, about software. So if you ask anyone, when is code correct? When do you consider code correct? Mostly people will say, well, when it does the thing I expect it to do. So I have some expectation of what the code should do. I write it, I run tests until it does what I think it should do. More formally, that's a specification. You have a specification for what your code should do, and it's correct when it meets that specification. So if we want to do formal verification, we need to have a formal specification of the code. This is something that's precise, something that's unambiguous, and abstract. It tells us what the code should do, not necessarily how. So as an example, if we want to talk about lists and sorting lists, we can have a formal specification of what a sorted list is. Informally, we have a function called sortList for abstract that takes an input list and outputs a list. So input is L, output is L prime. And informally, we can say, well, this specification for sorting a list is that L prime is sorted, which is nice. But formally, we want to be a little bit more specific. So we provide a more formal definition. The input list and the output list are the same length. The output list is a permutation of the input list. And the elements in the output list are increasingly larger. We also deal with abstract data types rather than concrete data types. So in our formal specifications, we'll have an abstract list, something that you can index, something that you can take the length of, and so on. But it doesn't tell us how the list is necessarily implemented. So it's different than an implementation, which might be a linked list, for example. And then we have our implementation. This is code, for example, in the C language or another language. And it's concrete. It tells us how we do something, not just what, but how. So we call the formal specification A, we call for abstract, and we call the implementation C for concrete. Now, when we're doing formal verification, we use a formal model of the code. So we don't use C source code directly, but we use a formal representation of C code, for example. And that comes with a whole bunch of rules about what the semantics of the C code is. So what happens when you run certain instructions. Great. So given this formal specification, given this code, we want to prove that it's correct. So what does that mean? A little bit more formally, we want to prove that the state after executing the code fulfills the specification, the abstract specification. So what do we mean by the state? Well, we have an initial state. We have some state of the system, some abstract state of the system. We execute the code, and then we have some state after executing the code. So we have S as the initial state, T is the state after execution. And then execution is defined formally by the formal model of the code. And it defines the behavior of each command and how it modifies the state. So once we run the code, we have some idea of how the initial state is modified to the final state. So what do we want to prove? Well, we want to prove that the final state after executing the code, so state T, fulfills whatever specification we have. And there are two common approaches to doing that. The first is Ihor logic. The second is refinement. So I'll talk about both of those. The idea behind Ihor logic is to introduce these things called Ihor triples. And a Ihor triple consists of a precondition, some code, and a postcondition. And the intuition behind Ihor logic and doing proofs in Ihor logics in these Ihor triples is that if the precondition P holds before you execute your code C, then the postcondition Q will hold as well in a correct program. So if the program's correct, if P holds and then you do execute C, then Q will hold. So as an example, we could say that the precondition for our abstract sort function is that L is a valid list. So the input list is a valid list. And the postcondition after we sort the list is that the output list is a valid list, that there's a permutation, and that the elements are increasing. So this is basically our specification. And so we find that when we're doing this kind of Ihor logic, these Ihor triples, that our postcondition is typically what represents our specification. It's a desired property of the code. When we want to prove such a Ihor triple, we need to prove that if P holds for the initial state, when we then modify that state using the commands into state T, then Q will hold for that final state. And in doing the proof, we use the behaviors as defined in the formal model of the language of the implementation to show for each command how it modifies the state and that the final state matches Q. If we have a larger program with a lot of commands, then we break that up into sub-goals. So we have kind of sub-postconditions and sub-preconditions, but we show that the overall chain matches those initial pre- and post-conditions. The other approach is refinement. So we say that the implementation refines the specification. So the concrete implementation refines the abstract specification. And the intuition behind that is that any behavior in the concrete implementation is allowed by the abstract specification, as well as all the behaviors in the abstract specification are present in the concrete code. Typically, we'll separate the specification and the implementation, and the specification will have an abstract version or abstract specification of every function that's in the concrete implementation. So, for example, our abstract specification could be an abstract function to sort the list, which again has the same properties that we talked about before. The lengths are the same, it's a permutation, and the elements are increasing. When we want to prove refinement, what we need to show is that when the concrete code and the abstract code start in an initial state, and then you execute them, the state that they end up in is essentially equivalent. So they start in a state that's essentially equivalent. They end up in a state that's also essentially equivalent, which means they do the same thing. We need to formalize this essentially equivalent idea, and so we introduce a state relation. And this talks about how the initial state, or the concrete state, maps to the abstract state. What's the relation between the two states? So here's an example of a state relation that says, OK, well, the lengths are the same, and the elements of the lists are the same. So if we have two essentially equivalent states in the abstract and the concrete, then two lists should have the same length and the same elements, and then the states are the same. We take this state relation, and then we show that formally that if the state relation holds between the initial states S and S prime, then after we execute C, after we execute A, the states T and T prime will also have the state relation between them hold. And if that's the case, then we can say that C refines A. So we have this kind of nice square. So that's nice. So that's formal verification 101. Hopefully everyone now can go off and prove code correct. But this still doesn't tell us how this formal verification leads to better security. So before talking about that, what do I mean by better security? Well, bad security means we have vulnerabilities. So better security means less vulnerabilities. What do we mean by vulnerabilities? Well, I don't really need to tell you much about them, but just to make it complete, we have three classes of vulnerabilities. So there's the design vulnerabilities, where you make a mistake in your design or your architecture of the system such that it doesn't actually fulfill the security policy that you want. We've got implementation vulnerabilities, where you make mistakes in your code that allow people to use those mistakes, use those bugs, to bypass your security policy and bypass your security mechanisms. And then we've got operational vulnerabilities, where you make mistakes in how you actually deploy or configure your system, or people make mistakes. So you get social engineering, you get people who just make mistakes or not very good at what they do. Formal verification can help us with the design vulnerabilities and the implementation vulnerabilities. So I'll talk about how they do that. I talked about how formal verification allows us to prove properties about code, which is nice, but typically those properties don't relate to security. They talk about things like the list is sorted. They talk about application domain properties, which are not necessarily security. However, it gives us an extra benefit in that it also helps us to prevent implementation vulnerabilities. So that if we can prove these nice abstract properties, these nice application-specific properties about our code, we can also prove that a bunch of implementation vulnerabilities don't exist in that code. Why is that? Well, a lot of implementation bugs happen because they're actually undefined behavior. This is things like array or list-bound overflows. If you access past the bound of a defined array, that's really undefined behavior, especially in your formal model. Integer overflow and underflows, if your integers don't have limits, then you don't overflow or underflow them. So that doesn't really exist. Following null pointers is undefined behavior, and so on. So our specification, the formalisms and the languages we use for the specifications don't allow these things to happen. You're not allowed to define it in that language because it's undefined. So these kind of implementation bugs that most of you love don't happen in the formal specs. Of course, they do happen in real code. So writing past the end of array is something that C programmers love to do. They do it all the time. What we need to do is make sure that doesn't happen. And so what happens is that if you try to prove that this kind of code fulfills its specification, and again, that specification may have nothing to do with array bounds. It could be something else. You'll fail. You won't be able to prove that code that contains these kind of statements fulfill their specification. So for example, the end state, after you try to access an array out of bounds formally, is not defined. There is no state. And so trying to prove properties about something that has no state is not going to work. Furthermore, there are no rules that you can apply in your proof about no state. And so you can't continue your proof. So trying to prove something with these kind of bugs in it just won't work. You won't be able to prove it. And so that forces you to either fix your code if you want to continue your proof, or if you're sure that your code is not broken, which none of us write broken code, so we're sure of that. You need to prove that the conditions that lead to the undefined behavior won't happen. So if you're certain that your array indexing code will never index the array out of bounds, then you need to prove that in order to continue your proof. So once you get a fully proved system, then you know these things don't exist. The big benefit of that is that you're proving properties, interesting properties about your system, and without having to specify all of these implementation vulnerabilities or bugs, the proof for free finds those vulnerabilities for you, finds those bugs for you, and forces you to do something about them. So you don't have to tell the system, find me all the array-bound overflows. It finds those for you because those are undefined. So whole classes of undefined behavior just disappear once you've proved your system. So that's really great. I want to go into a little bit more practical detail. So I've said we have this verified operating system, and I want to talk about what we've done, how you apply this in practice. So how would you apply what I've just talked about with this Ihor logic, with this refinement, and so on, with proving properties to a real system? So SEL4 is this microkernel we've developed. It's small, which means it's amenable to formal verification. It's fast, which means it's useful for real-world use. It's capability-based, which ultimately means that it has an explicit access control model. So it's really good for talking about secure systems. And it's the operating system kernel, which means it runs in privilege mode, which means it's one of the most critical parts of software. So it's critically important to get it right, which is why we formally verified it. So what did we verify? What got verified about SEL4? SEL4's verification showed functional correctness, which shows that the implementation refines the spec. So that's the refinement I was talking about before. The implementation of SEL4 refines the specification of SEL4. It means that the kernel does exactly what the specification says, no more and no less, which is nice. Hopefully the specification says something useful. Hopefully it says something about building secure systems and so on. Well, what does the spec say? It talks about the behavior of system calls. So it defines what each system call does. So for example, if you have a system call that sends a message from one thread to another, it defines how invoking that system call is going to change the state of the kernel. So you have an initial state, you invoke a system call that sends a message. What's the state after you've sent the message? That's nice, but that doesn't say anything about security. So we don't explicitly talk about security in the specification that was proved about SEL4. Okay, so what's the point? If we want to have this kernel and we want to verify it in order to be able to say that it's secure, but we don't say anything about security in the spec, what's the point? Well, we still get these proofs about lack of all this undefined behavior that I talked about before. So in proving the properties of the system calls, we've also proved that there aren't buffer overflows, there aren't null pointers being followed, et cetera. There aren't integer overflows or underflows, et cetera. So all this undefined behavior doesn't exist in the implementation of the kernel, which makes it a lot harder for you to exploit the kernel, which is good. That's good for security. But we can also prove properties about the specification itself. So we can go a level higher and start making interesting proofs about the specification itself. And because of refinement, because we've shown that the implementation refines the specification, if we make proofs about the specification, we know that those proofs also hold for the implementation of the kernel. So we know that if we actually invoke a system call and we prove that that has some other properties other than it's just correct, then that will hold for the actual implementation. So what are these properties that we proved about the specification? Well, we wanted it to be secure. So we wanted to show that given an access control policy, which you can think of as an access control matrix or a specification of what authority subjects have to other subjects. So who can, for example, modify, who can access, who can read what data, et cetera, that the kernel will enforce that policy. And this comes down to the classic security properties, the classic CIA properties of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we've proved confidentiality about the kernel spec, we've proved integrity about the kernel spec, and we've partially proved availability about the spec. What does integrity mean in this context? Well, generally, the general definition of integrity is that you can't make unauthorized modifications. More specifically and formally, we have this nice Ihor triple that says, given a precondition, so the initial state S0, that's what the precondition part means, if we make one of these abstract kernel calls, so a system call, after the call, the state afterwards, which is state S, the difference between initial state and final state will be authorized by the policy. So there won't be any changes to the state that aren't authorized by this access control matrix. That's the property that's been proved about the kernel specification. I won't go into details about how that was proved. There's a paper about that you can read if you're really interested. The other property, which is a little bit more complicated, is confidentiality. So confidentiality says that you can't read or learn unauthorized data. And so there's this longer statement here that says if the initial states are equivalent, then if we have initial states of the same two different initial states are equivalent, if we do the same executions on both of those states, then the final states will also be equivalent with regard to the security policy. And so the picture, what it shows is on the left, these two initial states where the green parts are equivalent. These are the non-confidential parts. And then the red and the yellow parts are the confidential parts, and those are different. If we then execute the same instructions for this subject, let's say it's a process, if we execute the same instructions for this process, then the final state that they end up in will be the same, even though the confidential states might be different. So what that means is the confidential data doesn't leak into the non-confidential parts of the system. So we've proved that about the kernel as well, which is great. This gives you a bit of an idea of how using formal or formal verifications can lead to better security. We can reduce implementation vulnerabilities, but we can also have interesting, abstract, higher-level properties, security properties that we can use to build our systems on top. So I'm going to talk about why this is not a silver bullet. Why does it not mean that we have hack-proof systems? If we want to build a verified secure system, we need to start with an overall threat model for the system, which leads to security requirements. It leads to properties that we have to have on the system. And then we start at a high-level architecture or a design. And so we need to design and architect our system such that these properties hold, these high-level properties hold. So in this example, it might be that information only flows from domain A to B, and it always goes through some sort of trusted component that maybe filters it or something like that. So we want to prove that this architecture fulfills that property. So we can do that. We can do a high-level architecture proof about that. But then at some point, we need to implement that. And so that architecture gets translated into a bunch of code. That could be manually written code. That could be existing tools. That could be generated code, and so on. And then we need to show that this code also fulfills some properties. And the properties might be that it's a refinement of the architecture. So any data flows that are allowed in the architecture are also allowed in the code, but the code doesn't allow other data flows. So we can prove that as well, which is nice. We need to run that on something, so we need to run it on an operating system and a bunch of services. It relies on that operating system and services, so we need to prove that as well. Well, now we've got a bunch of code. We need to actually load it into a running system, so we've also got a bootloader. Ideally, we would need to verify that to make sure it does the right thing. And that ultimately needs to run on hardware. So we should also verify the hardware. What I'm getting at here is that building a secure system requires different layers of abstraction. And each of those layers have different properties, and each of those layers need to be shown to be correct to fulfill those properties as well. Now, we've got this idea of necessary versus sufficient. It's not sufficient to just verify some of those layers and expect that you will have a verified secure system. So if you just verify the top layer, the architecture, you can have a nice architecture, but you can have implementation bugs in the architecture. You can have problems in the operating system, in the loader, in the hardware that allow you to bypass that. And so you don't have a fully verified system. So if you want a fully verified secure system, you need to verify all of those layers. And if you don't, vulnerabilities can sneak in there. The other thing is that with formal verification, we're working on models. And models aren't necessarily the same as reality. There's always some gap between the model and the reality. You can try to make that gap as small as possible, but there will be a gap. And this manifests itself as assumptions. So we have assumptions about the real world that our proofs, our models, and our proofs rely on. So some examples of these assumptions, practical assumptions are, well, we might assume that boot is correct. So the hardware and the software environment are initialized correctly so that when our verified code runs, or our model runs, that it has a particular environment. We might make assumptions about how the hardware behaves. We have to have a specification of the hardware. We make assumptions that the hardware is implemented correctly so that it actually matches the specification. We can make assumptions about semantics about our programming languages. So if we take code in C and we transform it into a formal model, we make some assumptions about the semantics of the programming languages. So we need to assume that those are true. We may have unverified code in our system. So we may be using third-party libraries and stuff like that. So we need to make assumptions about that code as well. So there's lots of assumptions that might need to be made. And if you want your verification to be believable, to be good, then you need to validate those assumptions. And those assumptions, as I showed in the previous case, can be validated by doing formal verification as well, or you can do your testing and your hardening and so on those things and so on. And if you don't do that, then this is where vulnerabilities can sneak in as well. There's the assumptions are fundamental, right, because of this gap between the model and reality. But there are also other potential limitations that are more practical that can be dealt with, but you need to put effort into dealing with them. So one, as I've talked about, is the specification should say something useful. So you need to validate the specification. You need to make sure that it says something useful. For example, like we did by verifying properties about SEL4 specification. The verified code needs to actually be used correctly. So for example, it needs to be configured correctly. If you misconfigure the code, that might invalidate some assumptions that you make, and therefore the proof might not hold. If, again, this idea of necessary versus sufficient also holds. If you use verified code, but it relies on a bunch of unverified code, then a lot of your assumptions might also break. Finally, scalability is a big issue. Verification is hard. One of the proof engineers in our group said that it punishes you for every mistake in a terrible, unforgiving way. So a lot of people don't become proof engineers because it's hard. But it also takes a long time to do proofs. And so you're limited in what you can verify. And that means that you need to make decisions, but important design decisions, such that the parts of the system that you do verify support being able to use unverified code on top of that. So for example, in SEL4, we have confidentiality and integrity proofs, which means that we can run unverified code on top of SEL4 and still have guarantees that there's confidentiality and integrity between them. And we don't necessarily need to verify that code running on top. So we can use that to build secure systems on top of that without having to verify all the code. But all of these things, the fact that you don't necessarily verify all the code, that you may misconfigure and so on, also can lead to vulnerabilities sneaking in. So this comes back to the question, does formal verification really lead to better security? And the answer is yes, it does. In particular, it can lead to better security because it makes you define specifications. It makes you define security properties, and you can have secure specs, which is an important basis for building secure systems. It also forces you, if you prove a system, to deal with all of the implementation bugs, implementation vulnerabilities in the system. So both of those lead to much better code, much better security options. Of course, it's not a silver bullet. It does not guarantee hacker-proof code because we've got assumptions, we've got the models, the coverage of verification might not be complete, people might misuse the verified elements, and so on. So that's the end of my talk. If you want to have more information about SEL4 or what we do at Trustworthy Systems, those are the URLs. Otherwise, if you've become interested in formal verification and you want to explore this and see what it can do for you, there's a nice blog post on proofcraft.org about starting into verification, how to become a proof engineer, what you should do. All right, thank you.